Hey everyone, it's Rick. Thanks for joining me on another Inwyt Walkabout. It's a beautiful morning again in the winter here in the Northeast. I am walking in one of the state parks in one of the trails. Snow's on the ground, it's 28 degrees. It's a beautiful morning, but another threat of storm this afternoon, so enjoying the outdoors before that happens. I wanted to continue our conversation about the elements within conflict that, contribute to the outcome of, distress and so forth. We've talked about division, we've talked about assumptions, we've talked about subjectivity, and we started to see how all of these things are actually connected. And what I wanted to share with you today is a story of comparison, the impact of comparing and how that plays into all of this. And take you back to when I was a medical student, a first-year medical student, and we were eager and we had a class in epidemiology and we're learning statistical method, and our professors decided that we should do sort of a live study as an example. Not necessarily a great study, but one to just get a feel for, sort of different approaches to understanding problems with statistics. And they decided to put forward the question, does alcohol have an impact on one's ability to exercise? There had been some studies in the past that suggested that maybe it did, and they proposed that we go to a high school track and divide the class of 100 up into, equal cohorts, one that had a real beer to drink and the other that had, a non-alcoholic equivalent, and that we do a comparison of running a quarter mile around the track and seeing whether there was any, statistical significance between the groups. So regardless of, the quality of the study, we divided up and, we each sort of had our blinded beverage to consume before we ran. And then every one of us, ran around the quarter mile track as fast as we could. And we were timed and, it was measured. So, it started out fairly benign. I think we were all just kind of excited to just be outside. It was late summer, early fall. And, all of a sudden it went for me from, again, sort of this blinded experiment to one of watching people run around the track. And clearly not everybody was in the same shape. People run at different speeds. And, rather than just kind of watch it neutrally, part of me started to say, all right, this guy's running really slow. I'm sure I can run faster. And it started having sort of a competitive edge to it. And by the time that I got up to my turn to run, my mindset was, I'm going to run as fast as I can. I don't know which beverage, I've had, alcohol or not alcohol, but I'm going to run fast. And at the very least, I'm going to show that I'm faster than a lot of these people who are running. So I'd already twisted the experiment into my own comparative experiment, if you will. And so I set off, the timer went off and I went off full speed ahead. I hadn't exercised in, intensely for months. And about halfway around the track, my legs started to feel really sore, and I started to feel my quadricep muscles really starting to pull, to really get hurt. But there was a part of me that, just said, well, you got to keep running. You can't stop. You can't stop because you're hurt. Keep going. And I kept pushing, and by the time I got to the end, I was in so much pain that I could barely run because I had really hurt and injured my muscles in both legs. And at that point, it didn't even matter what the time was, or what the experiment was about. I was in agony, and probably for about 30 minutes couldn't even walk. And then I spent the rest of that month basically limping around and recovering from a severe muscle injury in both legs. And the purpose of the experiment was out, the statistical one, and it didn't even matter what my time was or anything else. It was just, I was hurt, and needed to recover. So, again, like, what's the point of this? Well, again, look at how seemingly innocent comparison, a study, became for me a competition and a comparative study, if you will, of me versus my classmates, and whether I was faster than the others, and trying to prove something to myself and maybe to the class, about my ability as a runner, which had absolutely nothing to do with why we were there. But I turned it into this personal competition, if you will, and comparison, where I was now comparing myself against my peers. It didn't matter whether it was alcohol or non-alcohol consumption. It was just, am I faster than the other? And when I got injured halfway through, my one part of my brain was saying, you better stop. My body's telling me you're hurting yourself. And another part of me is going, keep running, because basically it's a sign of weakness if you stop. Crazy stuff. And, the latter won out. And I got hurt. So, comparison, again, when it's functional, doesn't necessarily have any bad repercussions to it. But watch how easy it is for us to twist something that seems pretty functionally harmless, and maybe it's actually important for whatever it is we're trying to solve, turn into something personal. Where if you have a problem that you're trying to solve, or you're doing a research study, or you're just trying to find something out, all of a sudden it becomes not only about, or less about, trying to get to an answer, as much as it is, whose idea was it? Well, it was my idea, not your idea. So now we're comparing who came up with the idea versus who is following along with the idea. And if you're in research, it becomes all about publication. I'm going to publish this, and don't take my publication away from me, because I came up with the idea. So all of these relatively silly, but elements that we think are so important get in the way of just living and looking without judgment and without interpretation and without competition. And we just end up in these spaces that, again, can physically hurt you, as it did with me, but also, just from a stress level and from an emotional well-being standpoint, are also very harmful. So think about that as you go about your day. And the other important thing that I just want to remind you all is that I'm sharing stories of things that have happened to me in the past as examples. And what I would invite you and encourage you to look at is not what have you done in the past, but look at how this shows up in your everyday existence, in the moment. And see how naturally we end up doing comparisons and interpretations, and how it immediately has so many layers of complexity that start to happen, and it gets very personal, and you end up many times being frustrated, or looking down on somebody as a result. So that's it for today. Leave you one more time with another view of the walk. Nice trail. Again, it's very quiet. And next time we'll pick up on another element of all of these things that we're talking about: division, subjectivity, assumptions, comparison, and start to see again how all of these things interplay continuously in our daily activities. So this is Rick with Inwyt Walkabout. I hope you have a fabulous day and a great week, and I look forward to our conversation next time. Take care.